Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Safeguarding and Education Overview and Scrutiny Committee, today the 25th of July. Item 1, apologies.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies received from Councillors Eagland and Jessel Perry. Thank you.
Thank you. Item 2 then, any declarations of interest? No. Item 3, minutes of the meeting, the last meeting held on the 13th of June. I assume everyone's had the opportunity to look at them and is happy for me to sign them as a true and accurate record. Thank you. Item 4 is the resettlement team, which is the first report that we have today. In the pack you'll find it starts on page 9. Councillor Wilson, did you want to introduce it?
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, members. I'm here with Natasha Moody, who is the Assistant Director for People for Wellbeing and Partnerships. I just wanted to start by just making it quite clear that this paper is in relation to people with refugee status as opposed to asylum seekers. We've been helping people to resettle in Staffordshire since 2014, right back from the Syrian resettlement team through Afghans Find Your Own Home schemes. We've had the Homes for Ukraine scheme, we've had arrivals from Hong Kong, and others such as families arriving here from Pakistan. Initially, teams in Staffordshire County Council had to work very quickly on their feet and very skillfully in order to ensure that our guests received the help that they needed in the right way and at the right time. And this has not been without its challenges. DLUC and the Home Office has worked with Staffordshire County Council in order to support the integration of refugees into our communities. However, at the beginning, we didn't have an existing body of staff in order to focus on the work that was required. With the work that Natasha Moody and the team has done in creating a team that can work individually with people resettling here in Staffordshire, we've managed to create really what I would call a wraparound service for these new residents. And at the beginning, when this team was first formed, there was criticism directed towards the team and to the county council. Things like, you know, why didn't you offer a free bus pass to everybody that came here, as an example? And the answer to that was simply because people didn't require one, or there was another way around working to do what it was that people needed. And now we're being asked by people, how have you managed to do this so well and so cohesively and in such a slick way? And it almost feels as if we're offering a bespoke service for people. That's how successful really it's been. We've listened, we've understood, and we know what it is that people actually want and need. And now we have a really, really great service here in Staffordshire that we can provide to those who need it. There are still pressures, though, in terms of the slow turnaround of Afghans arriving into Swinnerton. We're having to do things such as arrange education on site for the children there, and we're working very closely with Staffordshire's education team in order to facilitate that. And we're also seeing increased numbers of arrivals and the challenge of partnership working and actually getting accurate data that's coming in, that's being received by us, and working with that data. I'm going to hand over to Natasha Moody now, and she's going to explain in more detail some of the really great work that's been done by her team, and, you know, tribute really to a fantastic team that's had to sort of hit the ground running and got us to where we are. And actually, we have a very good operation here in Staffordshire, but also talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we're seeing here that we're going to see going forward. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. So, just to summarise, the ask in our paper that's on its way to Cabinet is to approve the permanent appointment of the resettlement team. For those of you that might not remember, the resettlement team was formed on the back of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. So originally when the first scheme was set up, the Syrian resettlement scheme, the numbers were really small. There was only less than 100 people who arrived in Staffordshire in family groupings across the county. And at that time we commissioned two organisations, Spring Housing and Refugee Action, to provide interim support. So they would find a home and accommodation for those families who were settling here. They'd provide some of that support to enable them to integrate into the community. And what we saw through those schemes was that actually some of the objectives that we've got as a council in terms of getting people into work, making sure people have got sustainable places to live, making sure people felt happy and healthy, weren't necessarily the outcomes that families were experiencing at the end of that intervention and support. So when Homes for Ukraine came along, it provided an opportunity for us to think differently. So again, for those of you that don't know, the way these schemes are funded is not necessarily on a funding rate. So we don't get, for example, a set funding tariff over a period of time to provide that interim support. We get a tariff per person who arrives. So the current tariff is about £10,000 per family who arrive. And so we have to use that money in quite a different way to try and think about how we can provide that sustainable support. So when Homes for Ukraine came and we saw a large number of arrivals, we were able to use that budget to establish a team. And I think it's fair to say, as kind of Victoria alluded to in her introduction, that that team has really gone from strength to strength, and I'm incredibly proud of the work they've done. And I have to say, you know, it's not any of the work I've done, it's absolutely credit to them in the way they've worked together as a team. They've done a lot of different things. They've tried and tested lots of new different approaches, but I actually think they're starting to have a real significant impact. And as Victoria said, one of the reasons for that is because they provide the families with a personalised budget that helps them to break down some of the barriers to accessing services and support that they might see. And we have had some incredible stories that have kind of come from that. So we've had a Ukrainian who managed to use some of the funding to pay for him to get settled into university, is now doing a scholarship at one of the universities and doing really, really well. We've had other people who've used it for driving lessons so that they don't need bus passes and other kinds of things, but there have been some real successes to that way of working. The team really do go into the family home, provide that wraparound support, so they work with them to develop a personalised and bespoke plan, to understand what their ambitions are for them as a family, but also to help them understand what it's like to live in Staffordshire, how they can integrate into that community, understanding some of our customs and norms, because there's a lot of things that we have to kind of talk to them about really in terms of orientating them into the place. For example, with some of the Ukrainian families who arrived, they couldn't understand our aspiration to get them out of the house. They thought it was unusual. They like to spend a lot of time in their own house, which obviously to host was something they weren't used to. So I think understanding some of those cultural differences has been really, really important. So we've had that team in place for 2 years. We've talked to you about some of their performance and some of the good news in the report, and hope that shines through really. But what we want to do is, over the last year, as we've started to see the introduction of new schemes, so again, it's probably important to acknowledge that when the Home Office work with us, they don't necessarily have an approach to migration that's kind of like, we've got this one approach and this is the way we want families to kind of resettle in the UK. They work in different schemes, so you've got lots of different schemes. We've tried to make it as simple as we possibly can in the report, but do ask any questions if it's not as clear as it needs to be. But they operate schemes for Afghan families, schemes for Hong Kong nationals, schemes for Syrians. You know, it's all very different depending on the type of people. But actually what we've used is the same resettlement team to work with all of those different families. And whilst their individual differences are very unique to them, actually the way of working and that wraparound support and the things that we're trying to achieve as a team are the same. So we want all families who settle here to have permanent accommodation, to feel safe in their community, to be able to access good jobs and to be part of that community in which they live. So those things are the same regardless of what scheme they arrive on. So we've used that same team to work with a broader range of people over the last 12 months to just try and test that approach. Now, because we don't have permanent funding, what we have done is use the funding we've got to employ the team, but we have also accumulated some money, which means we can afford to keep the team for longer. So that's what we're asking Cabinet to do, to use that money that we've got available, which is ring-fenced to spend on resettlement, but to maintain the team for a longer period of time. And what we plan to do is make some small changes to the team in terms of the size and capacity based on the demand we know we're seeing now, But actually, we think it's important that we maintain some level of staff team to give us that continuity of care. I think what that allows us to do as well is be fleet of foot if other things do start to emerge in terms of areas of work. It means that the team are able to respond to that. You know, as we've seen in the past, we've had bridging accommodation that was set up, and that required other staff working in the local authority to drop other stuff and kind of respond to those emergency situations that arose. So we're hoping it gives us some resilience, really. I suppose in terms of continued challenges, which we hope this team will help us with, I think the main one to point out is that we don't think this is necessarily going to be an issue that's easily resolved. I think there is a need for the Home Office, and the Leaders Board have been lobbying quite hard for them to think differently about resettlement and migration in the round and not necessarily bombarding us with lots of different schemes. So that's one that we're still kind of working on corporately to try and influence that change. And the other one is definitely the funding tariff attached to people, because that makes it really difficult for us to manage with a staff team that are based on a temporary funding pot, essentially. So those are the key challenges that we've got, and obviously our risks that we've outlined in the report. But we don't think we should shy away from kind of making that team a permanent team, so that we have got that resilience. All of the staff team and those that are appointed to it will be made aware that it is funded temporarily, and we're doing everything we can to try and resolve that. And they will know that obviously, should the funding cease, those posts will be subject to redundancy just like any others might be. So I think it's important that we give them all of the information that we have to hand, really, so that they can make informed decisions about the posts that are available as well. And I think that's it in terms of an overview. Happy to take any questions people might have on the paper.
Thank you for that. A really good explanation and an excellent report. Can I just have some clarification around the schemes? I know that you were talking there about it gave me the impression it doesn't seem to matter where the individuals come from, then the approach is the same. Is the ARAP and ACRS schemes, they relate to Afghan nationals, as I understand it. And then there's a different scheme, which is a visa scheme for people from the Ukraine. So are there therefore different objectives around those two groups of people? The former strikes me as being true resettlement, whereas the people on a visa, and I also understand there's an extension to the visa. Was it 3 years, but now you can have an extension of one and a half. Does that bring any additional challenges around resettlement? And what is the objective around, can you treat both sets of people the same, or do they have different requirements?
Okay, so the ARAP, so that's the Afghan Relocation Assistance Policy, is for Afghan citizens who were worked with the UK government. So they're treated as a very specific cohort, and they are given quite clear rights to arrive and be part of that resettlement programme. Those who are ACRS is the Afghan Citizen Resettlement Programme, and that is for people who've assisted, for example, with democracy, not necessarily worked on behalf of the local government, but actually done things in that country that poses them at a significant risk. For example, they might have demonstrated in terms of women's rights. Both of those schemes, while separate, the outcomes in terms of their resettlement when they get here are the same. So they both come with different criteria around them. They're both trying to determine what programme they fit really and then slot them in. And I think that's more in terms of, that's more important for people like the Home Office, for example, who are trying to understand where and how people are arriving into the country. Once they get here, their needs, their way of living, the ambitions we have in terms of how we resettle them are largely similar. When we set up the bridging accommodation, it was a mixture of both types of families, and you really can't tell any difference other than the stories they tell you about, when they lived in Afghanistan, really. So both of those programmes, whilst they're called different things, the impact and consequence locally, I think, is negligible. In terms of Homes for Ukraine, yes, very different scheme in terms of the setup to either the ACRS or the ARAP scheme, mainly because it was the first time, I think, ever that we've seen this country kind of open for local people to say, you know, would you like to sponsor somebody to arrive here, open your doors of your home and provide them with adequate space within your property to make a temporary home here while they were facing those challenges in the war in Ukraine. So it was very, very novel, came with a lot of challenges early doors in terms of how we made sure people were suitable and safe, especially with people evacuating literally overnight. So it was a very different kind of scheme and response. But again, once those Ukrainians arrived here, whilst I know they're on a visa, and again, I'm not sure how long that will last. I think this is, you know, I think it's a responsive scheme, isn't it, to the changing situation that they face in Ukraine. Once they get here, again, their integration into the community and what we have seen over the course of the programme is very similar. You know, people want a place to live, they want a place to work, they want to be able to be part of the community in which they live, they want to feel healthy and happy, they want to get their children into school. So those things are all largely the same. So I think there are definite differences in the scheme and what it means, particularly for national government and you know, the families that might sponsor them to be here or the property that they settle in to start with. But longer term, our ambition with those people is to get them set up in their own properties, being able to pay their own rent or mortgage, being able to live independently. And really what this team does is give them a bit of a jump start, really, to get them all of the stuff that they need to understand how they can do that independently themselves.
Thank you for that. I think, as we all know, we live in a very, very volatile world, and this could change, couldn't it? Because we could have disorder anywhere else. And I suppose I'm just trying to get an understanding of the point that you made about the funding, and there's no guarantee of that funding, and people are working in that environment where they understand that. And it was interesting to hear that we get a fixed amount of funding per individual. My understanding, I think it was Operation Pitting, as I seem to recall, which was those dreadful sites that we saw of people clinging onto aeroplanes that were trying to take off. And the fact it's very difficult to leave Afghanistan at the moment. Where is the increase in demand coming from? And do we reach a critical point when, if that demand isn't there, and hopefully we don't have that demand, do we have a plan for managing that diminishing funding? Because I think, from what I could see, there were around 20 individuals involved in the scheme last year, and there's, 17 this year. And I know this is a very rough description of what I've read in here, but it seemed to be the old scheme was 10 people supporting another 10 that were doing the work, and we've now gone to 9 supporting 8 that are doing the work. At what stage does that become non-fundable if, as we expect, the numbers should start to drop, although it does say in the report that demand is increasing? We just need to understand where that demand is coming from.
So in terms of demand, we know that over the last 10 years, the number of people arriving into the country has remained largely static. So I'm not sure, I'm not convinced that the demand is necessarily going to dissipate. What we do know is, though, that we've budgeted, and you'll see that in the finance and resource section, for the next 4 years in terms of being able to use that pot to fund that team as is. So I think that gives you some assurance that actually over the next 4 years we've got enough money to be able to pay, even if we had no more money coming in. So if we had no new arrivals, we would still have enough money to be able to pay for the existing team for that time. I think there is a need for us as a team to continue to watch that. I'm very conscious, as is the resettlement lead, Andrea, that we need to make sure that, 12, 18 months we're taking that stock take to see where we are and what that looks like, because at the end of the day we want to give people adequate time should that situation change. My sense is that if we've planned and budgeted for now 4 years and we've still got people arriving, you would still have a 5th year effectively in train for that last year. So I think we have got some assurances in the short to medium term, but I think it is right, you know, to keep an eye on that. And I would actually welcome a discussion around how we use this committee maybe to support us to do that over the next 12 to 18 months.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And from what I've seen the report, you seem to have a good understanding of that. And I think it feels, it does feel about right. Councillor Pardeshi. I'll come to you next.
Thank you, Chair. With the utmost respect to you, Victoria, we might have to have a rethink about the blanket term of our guests, because the implication is that the people we're talking about are here temporarily and then expected to go back to where they came from. So though if we can have a rethink of that word. Two other quick points. I thought I'd written down the page number, but I haven't. We're told in the report to expect a slight reduction in some of the team, and on resettlement practitioners it says there will be a reduction from 10 to 4, which to me is quite a significant reduction, not a slight reduction. And resettlement practitioners also suggest to me that it's a very hands-on role. So my concern was if that, to what extent that will affect the work that you're doing. And my last point is, because of the report that we're talking about, when I got to the end, when it said the usual climate change implications, I thought, oh great, we're talking about climate refugees. But obviously it wasn't. It's that standard item we have at the end. But nonetheless, thanks to the behaviour of the Western world, we know that the poorer in this world are bearing the brunt of our life's consequences. So climate refugees is something else that we will have to consider more and more in the future as well, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so on the first point around guests, I do think I welcome that kind of challenge, but I do also think there is an acknowledgement that the vast majority of people who've resettled in Staffordshire are on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, and they are on temporary visas, so they are in fact here for a short period of time and then do return home. So I do wonder if there is a conversation to be had about how we phrase that in a way that actually is suitable. So I welcome that discussion. I think in terms of the broader issue then, so when Homes for Ukraine was first set up, we saw an incredible influx straight away. So overnight, pretty much, we had 790 people from memory arriving into Staffordshire, probably within a month of the war. And so the resource required at that time was very different than it is now. So all of those people who've arrived on Homes for Ukraine scheme have had a worker, they've had somebody go out and visit their home, they've gone and done an assessment of need, they've worked with them to develop a package of support around them and plan for how they can spend their personalised budget. And so actually that huge influx that we saw at that time, we've kind of got over that initial kind of challenge really. And I think that is the reason for wanting to reduce the number of staff, because we know with 40 arrivals every month and keeping on top of that, and potentially, 19 or so from the ARAP or ACRS schemes, actually that's manageable with 4 staff. So that's the reason for the reduction. I do take people's points around actually, we're dealing with a kind of unsettled picture, and actually there might be a need for us to think about, is there some halfway house? I suppose the challenge we've got is we're also trying to manage that budgetary constraint. So we're trying to, be as lean as we possibly can be and make the money last longer really. So that's probably one of the challenges. But I think we have done the maths around making sure that we've got enough members of staff to be able to do the visits that are required to be able to maintain the scheme based on the number of arrivals, and if there's any kind of, urgent requirements of families. So we have worked that through. And I think the second part was around, Oh, climate change, yeah. I mean, it is a standard thing that we're asked to include in our reports. You know, we do make sure that the resettlement teams are locally based, therefore mitigating the number of kind of journeys that they're doing and things like that. But the reality of it is, it's very difficult to quantify. They've not necessarily got office spaces that they're using. They are, you know, using their own home. So it's definitely something we'll continue to look at. We have actually got the climate change coming to our management meeting in September, so we'll try and pick their brains about how we might make sure we do that.
Thank you for that. I think the point about climate change was that we could have people from all sorts of situations arriving here.
Yeah,
I mean,
my
correct me if I'm
point
wrong.
was on a global one. Consequences of climate change. A significant part of Bangladesh is under water, drought experienced in Africa or whatever. So those, understandably, we're going to have more and more people wanting to leave those places.
Good point.
Thank
We'll
you,
make
Chair.
sure that's picked up as part of the
Yeah.
report.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon, I think you were next.
Thank you, Chair. My points are really a continuation of Bob Angeli. But first, I want to, I just want us to recollect the fact that the kinder transport in the late 1930s from Nazi Germany was a huge success. And clearly there were challenges then. But the proportion of those who contributed to public life subsequently was simply enormous. And when people come to this country, having suffered the difficulties that we all know, they're hugely grateful, by and large, and they really want to contribute. Now, we know that there's going to be bad eggs everywhere, and there's going to be examples where that's not the case. But by and large, that is the case. And I think it's good to keep in mind the fact that we're doing something that is, to my mind, not only a great help to them in very difficult circumstances, but could in the future be a huge benefit to this country. I just want to, the point of Gillian's piece about global warming and climate change migrants, it just exacerbates Bob's piece about the fact of geopolitical risk. And the one word that stood out for me in this report was the word reactive. This is a reactive service. And when you factor into that the cost, the price per case, and you're dependent on that, and even although you have the funding in the short term to hold on to things, you could find that that funding dries up, and then there's a wider European war, for instance. So that clearly has implications for lobbying, but it also has implications in-house. And there's two issues to my mind that I think need to be bottomed out. The first is, if people leave, we don't want that have to leave, we don't want to lose the historical legacy. We don't want to run down rabbit holes again, the ones that have already been run down and come to a blind alley. So are there things like exit interviews? Are you holding on to the detail and the on-the-ground difficulties that people have faced and how they've solved them when they go? So that is held within the institution such that when things do get difficult, and I think over time they'll get more difficult, if I'm honest. The second bit is that are we satisfied that the logistics and the protocols and the governance and the whole thing that we have at the moment is scalable, so that we don't have to reinvent the wheel? Because you said yourself, you had 790 in a month. that could easily be considerably larger if things got very difficult. Do we have systems in place that are scalable, such that if we had, for the sake of argument, 2,500 in a month, we could roll it out knowing that we're not going to run into the buffers? It's those two things that I think really are important, given the fact that the funding from central government is piecemeal and it's a price per case. Thank you.
Councillor Wilson.
I'd like to answer the first part of the question and then hand over to Natasha. I hope I'm not out of line by saying this. We actually have somebody that's come into this county who we've assisted to get to London every week to go and learn to play music at the London School of Music. And they're learning, they're getting a degree playing the piano. And that kind of story to me tells me everything I need to know about what we're doing here. It's not just something that's going to be wonderfully beneficial to that individual, but the riches that brings into our county, it's just unmeasurable. And I'm absolutely humbled and proud that we've been able to do that, and that's just one example. I've also heard, and I think Natasha may be able to tell us more, that we have people that have come here who, and I say guests because they arrive as guests, and then they become neighbours, and then they become part of our community, don't they? And in terms of Ukrainians, if they're fortunate, they get to go back to their homeland. I have heard stories about some of these people who have actually become volunteers in this county. And again, that's something that we just simply cannot measure. And the fact that we've been able to help people to do that and to feel good about themselves and feel as if they are part of the community is, unquantifiable. In terms of the exit interviews and the data, we do that. We did a similar thing with COVID as well, because we want to gather that information and analyse it and make sure that we are in a place where, if the unthinkable should happen, we're ready for that. But I'm going to hand over to Natasha because she'll have a lot more detail than me on that.
So on the point of the data and information that we collect, so we've had amazing support from the Civil Contingencies Unit, not only when we stepped up the bridge and accommodation, but also when we stepped up Homes for Ukraine. And as part of that, we've done some very focused and bespoke debrief sessions on the lessons learned. And we've used some of that to inform the plans that the partnership have moving forward. So, there've been some real practical lessons that the partnership has reflected on, where we could have done things differently or better or quicker or whatever it might have been. And so those have been actioned and overseen by the strategic migration partnership that we have in Staffordshire. So I'm confident that actually we've learnt the lessons, we keep a record of them, and we have a plan in place to make sure that they're captured as part of that partnership working. I think it's incumbent on us to make sure that we go back to that if something does happen, because I think it's really easy in the crisis moment to kind of forget all of those things and respond urgently again. And there were some really, practical lessons that we needed to take away as a partnership in terms of the differences that people, who arrived here kind of experienced, and actually how the partnership weren't necessarily ready for some of that. So I think hopefully that again gives you some confidence that we have done that piece of work. But again, we will make sure that that's referenced in the report, because I don't think we do it necessarily the justice it needs. In terms of the scalability of the team, if I think back to when the bridge and accommodation was set up, or the Homes for Ukraine was set up, I was fortunate in that I was here, so having an idea of what it requires to get that scale quite quickly, I'm very familiar with. I think that team being in place gives us that resilience. I would be more worried if we didn't have anything in place. And that was the position we were starting from. I am really lucky that we've got a really great team across Staffordshire County Council, and lots of people came together really quickly to go above and beyond their day job. People from communications, HR, all over the organisation kind of rattled round to kind of support. And I feel confident that actually, if we were in the worst possible position, people would do that again, because we've got that kind of culture within the county council. But also, I feel confident that with those staff being in place, we would have a level of resilience. We might have to drop some of the day-to-day work, which is less urgent, but we would, I think, have the resilience to be able to respond to some of those crises should they happen again. I will go back and have the conversation with Andrea about, you know, if we were talking double it, do we think we've got enough confidence to be able to do that, to just check? But I think given that we had, you know, a team of 0 last time and managed to do it, I think that should give us some level of assurance that actually we'll be able to get through it. And the other thing as well is a lot of us across the partnership and across the team have done a lot of training since those incidents took place. And again, we have shared some of that learning with the broader partnership. So a lot of people have had kind of debriefs, we've done action cards, we've done lots of prep work that means that the ask should be different next time. So again, I don't think it would necessarily require the same number of people that we had last time because we have got some of those kind of foundations in place really.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Councillor Burnett-Faulkner.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to ask, we've got a lot of people on these temporary visas, and I know they've been extended for another 1.5 years, but as you and I both know, 1.5 years just flies by like that. So have you got any plans in place if they were to go home, and how are you going to do that? Because obviously that's going to be a big project as well. And have you got the capacity to deal with that? Thank you.
So, as yet, we haven't had formal communication from the Home Office to say that that will be the drop-down deadline day. And so I think some of this, as we know, is a bit of a movable feast depending on what happens in Ukraine. So I think if it did happen, there isn't necessarily a role for the local authority in terms of arranging that move back. That would be a relationship between the Home Office and the guest. Now, they might ask us to do something, but I think if they did, they'd probably give us adequate time to prepare. I think at this moment in time, a lot of those people from Ukraine have moved into their own properties, got their own jobs, got themselves settled. A lot of people do want to go back home. You know, I've got, you know, strong ties back home, but a lot of people have made themselves alive here. So I think it's going to be quite a challenging situation when we get to that point, and I do think it is one that we continue to talk to the Home Office about and making sure that they give adequate time to prepare for that. I'm not seeing anything at this moment in time that's making me think that that's something they're thinking is imminent. So yeah, we continue to have the conversation, we continue to ask, we continue to make sure that we are prepared should that be the case. And I think what we would be able to do is provide them with that information for people that we know are living in Staffordshire, because we've got good data around that. But actually, I'm not sure there would necessarily be a role for the local authority in terms of that move back.
So if they were on one of these temporary visas and it did get to the situation where, you know, the visa had run out and they were, would they have the opportunity to apply to stay if they decided that they didn't want to go back? I think that's one of the questions that a lot of people will be asking. And also, I think if they've come over here because they felt threatened over there, and then they've got this fear in their mind, even now, thinking in 1.5 years time, I'm going to be sent back and I could get killed when I get back. So how can we deal with that issue that's in their mind? It's their mental health, isn't it, again? So how can we deal with that and keep them safe?
So I'm not sure that's the role for the local authority. So that is a relationship between the Ukrainian guest and the Home Office. And so we do lobby on their behalf because we're working with those families and we understand their perspective. But actually, that requires Home Office action. You know, they need to fundamentally decide what they're doing, how it's going to work. You know, we have lobbied quite hard to get the extension on the visas, and they did come through with that. So I'm confident if we keep on talking as a group of local authorities, we do work quite closely with the LGA to lobby on their behalf with other local authorities. So I think we need to keep on kind of lobbying the Home Office to make sure that we get that traction that you describe.
Thank you for that. I also think perhaps the hand will be forced at some stage, because I do believe there's a 5-year hurdle that needs to be addressed at some stage. So I think some of these issues, and I echo what Natasha just said there, I think it's a Home Office decision, not a local authority decision. Councillor Snape.
Thank you, Chair. Can I thank you for, for the quality and the data and report. It's easy reading, and everything is in there, really, so thank you very much for that. Can also thank you for the fact that we've learned from, if you remember 7 or 8 years ago when we had the first Syrian refugees over here, It was very embarrassing for us as a county. They were put in places, really, where they weren't welcomed. One of those areas was Cannock Chase, where I'm a councillor for, and they were burnt, the house was burnt down, they were threatened, everything like that. So it's nice to see we've now learnt from that, we've moved forward. With the Ukrainian refugees, just because the war perhaps will stop one day in Ukraine, with the geopolitics of the world, it doesn't mean they'll be ready to go back there. There may be nothing to go back in many of the cities until things happen. So that could take, if we look at 45 after Germany had been bombed, it took many, many years to rebuild it. So really, they could be here for many, many years. I was going to mention kinder transport as Johnny did, so I shan't go into that now. So thank you for bringing that up, really. But when we look now at the budget, we're going as far as 27, 28, then possibly 28, 29. Is that fixed funding we've got now? It's not going to be taken away from us for anything, so at least we can guarantee that until then we can keep moving across at the rate we're doing and doing the job that you and your staff are doing for these people.
Yes, so that budget that's in there is income that we've already received from the Home Office to resettle people in Staffordshire, so that budget is there. It's in our reserves currently to be able to use, and the point of the paper is to make sure that we're spelling that out really in terms of getting that support to use it in this way.
Reverend Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the report. I'm a new boy here, so to speak, so please forgive me if my questions seem a little bit naive or ill-informed. I've got two particular areas, if I might. If you look on page 14 of the report, there's a reference to 57 children accommodated in the Swinnerton unit. It's not clear to me whether that is simply for educational and settlement purposes or whether that's actual living accommodation. And if so, this suggests that they're children not with the support of any family network. And I'd just like to know if that's the case, what's the size of that kind of concern? And that requires very much a fuller sort, wraparound support than families on their own. But it may be the simple answer to that question. Shall I leave it there?
Please ask the
Thank you. And the second question is a much more sort of philosophical question. People who come to this country and are welcomed bring with them an identity of their own, and to some extent there's likely to be a tension or a dialectic between the identity that they already have and the identity that they're going to develop in this country. So I just wonder how far their existing identity is respected and affirmed, and to what extent it's envisaged that they will retain something of that identity as they continue contributing to our society.
Thank you for that, and in no way were they poor questions at all. Natasha.
Shall I come back on the first one? So in relation to MOD Swinnerton, so that site's actually got 129 people accommodated on the site. They are family groupings, so the children are with the adults on the site. They tend to be much larger families, so the plan originally with MOD Swinnerton was only to use it for a temporary period of time, but because of the size of the families, the onward move is proving quite problematic in terms of getting larger accommodation sites for those families. So that's why that site is being used, and that's why it's been protracted, because I think they had originally planned to close it quite quickly. So the support that we provide to MOD Swinnerton is very different. There is a wraparound contract that's in place with an organisation called MEAS. So the local authority works alongside MEAS really to understand what is required from the local authority. So we go out with the District and Borough Council to do site visits to check what happens on site, to make sure that we're providing that education for the children on site. So it's a slightly different role. So they're not on their own, they are with their families. The one about identity is just such a lovely question. Thank you very much for asking it. And I say that because I moved over here, I was just talking to Victoria about that. I moved over here from Belfast, and I do very much feel like that is still part of my home, even though I've lived in Staffordshire for as long as I can remember. And Staffordshire feels like my home, so I think it's really important that we do acknowledge that people will have different parts of themselves. I have to say, and I might share it with you all after if that would be okay, the team have been doing some brilliant work. So Staffordshire County Council, along with partners, have signed up to something called the Co-Production Promise. And again, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you all to go and have a look at it, and again, can send you the link. And that co-production promise talks about how do you work with a family or a child or a parent that you're working with. And it talks about how do you share some of that power so that you understand their perspective on things. And I think that's something that the team have done really, really well, because they recognise that the challenges that the person faces when they arrive here can be very, very different and very unique to them and their individual circumstances. And so they've done this fantastic case study, which has actually been shared around the partnership around an Afghan family who've arrived here. And it was the very first family we resettled, actually, in East Staffordshire. And the family arrived here and, you know, we didn't really know what we were doing. It was the first time we'd done it. They were obviously coming here and had never done that before. So we all kind of agreed that we would learn from one another. And I have to say it's been a huge success. He has been a real advocate for working with the local authority and talking to other people from Afghanistan about how welcoming we are and how we try and understand the cultural differences and their identity and make sure that we can help them understand the community within which they're moving into, so that actually you do get that true integration into the community, because I don't think it's a sense that you kind of leave it at the door and then arrive here and it all changes, because it's not. You bring that sense of person with you, and he's done a lot of work with the team to try and help them understand the nuances and differences and how we might tweak our response. And so I do think we've been we continue to learn, because I don't think we'll ever stop learning. I think every single person's completely different, but we have done a lot of learning in terms of how do we make sure that we don't kind of have disregard for that sense of identity that is brought with them, and also help them to understand, you know, the community that they're moving into and how their you know, community might respond to certain things. Or, you know, I mean, we've had some really honest and frank conversations, you know, about, I know that might be what you're used to, but this is the way it works over here, so how are we going to make sure that we can both work together so that we've got something that meets both of our needs? So I think sometimes that richness of conversation is the most critical part of making sure that we do really get that community integration that we so need.
Thank you for those questions. Excellent questions. Just to add to what Natasha has already said, we obviously have ESOL lessons so that we can allow people to learn the language and learn the culture here in this county. That happens within our library service, for example. But also, just as a really great example, we had some staff and volunteers at the County Council Library Service actually shortlisted for an award, partly because of the work that they're doing in supporting people from Ukraine, and actually sharing what it is that they have to offer to us. And I think that's so important, that, you know, they can learn things here in this country and in this county, but we have so much to learn from them as well. And so we do these sort of things in the library service where we put the relevant books out. You know, we do, you know, different sort of showcases of different countries and so on. And actually, I'm really proud that we actually were shortlisted for an award at Warrington Community Managed Library exactly on that subject in terms of Ukrainians.
Thank you. Did you want to come back, Reverend, or are you? You have to turn the microphone on.
No, thank you very much for the sensitivity and professionalism of the answer. I'm just very aware that people will probably want to find ways of expressing their joint identity, if you like, their shared identity of both being here and also having roots elsewhere, in terms of things like religion and language, which won't, in a sense, necessarily be integrated into what is here in Staffordshire.
Could I come back on that? So just to add, part of the wraparound and integration support that we do provide as a team does look at access to faith organisations, making sure that they can access ESOL, as Councillor Wilson says. So we do take all of those things into consideration when we're putting that wraparound support package in place. We have had some issues with trying to make sure that we can always access ESOL in some areas, particularly where numbers are lower. And because of that, we've bought an online package to make sure that people have got access to that learning. So we are trying to make sure that that's embedded as part of that plan.
Thank you for that. And give the final question to Councillor McMahon.
Thank you, Chair. It's been covered. I withdraw.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Councillor Wilson.
Sorry, Chairman, I didn't know if you wanted me to read the recommendations or if that was something you're going to do, though. So.
Thank you for that. Thank you for allowing us to ask questions and the detail of those questions. Moving on to the recommendations, we have to acknowledge the progress that's been made. I think we all agree that we've done that. Acknowledge the changing reactive nature of the work, and that was already pointed out, and endorse this as a new approach. I'm hoping that I speak for the whole committee when I say that we do. I do think that I'd like to send our thanks to the team. They are dealing with some desperate people, leaving countries in very difficult circumstances, sometimes simply because you hold a different view to whoever is ruling. And I think, having read this report, it's clear that you have done a remarkable job in difficult and challenging circumstances. So I wonder if you'd pass that on to the team. Thank you again. Just a couple of seconds. Thank you for that. Moving on then to item 5, domestic abuse service, 6 months on. The report is at page 37. I just wondered if people could introduce themselves so the committee know who they are.
Hi, good morning everybody. I'm Detective Superintendent Nikki Furlong from Staffordshire Police.
Good morning, I'm Trish Caldwell. I'm from Staffordshire County Council, County Commissioner for Reg Services and Community Safety.
Good morning, I'm Catherine Mann, the Assistant Director for Culture, Rural and Safer Communities in Staffordshire County Council.
Thank you for that. Councillor Wilson, did you want to introduce them?
Thank you, Chairman. This paper is being presented to update members to provide an update on the commissioned domestic abuse services across Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent and the key pieces of work associated with domestic abuse. The committee is being asked to note and comment upon the progress that's been made to support victims, perpetrators and children. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the paper, and then I was going to make my recommendation to the committee, but I think that's within the remit of the chairman. So paragraphs 2 to 9 of the report provide the background to the commission service and services, and highlights that the overall annual contract value for the new victims and perpetrator provision, which is £3,375,221 per annum. Members will see that the County Council's annual contribution is £895,000 in total, and that's 27% of the contract value, with £683,860 from the County Council budget funding and an additional £211,140 from the Domestic Abuse Act duty funding, which is specifically for support in safe accommodation settings. The report also notes that under the legislative requirements of the domestic abuse duty, Staffordshire County Council has completed an extensive commissioning service, awarding 3 separate contracts to GLOW, Pathway and Staffordshire Women's Aid to provide support for domestic abuse victims living in safe accommodation settings. The main body of this report firstly provides an overview of the achievements of the service during the 5-year contract period, with more detail included in Appendix 1 of the report. Members will have seen that a total of 14,807 Staffordshire residents were supported by the Victim Service during the previous 5-year contract period, including 2,187 children. Between Year 1 and Year 5, annual referrals into the Victim Service increased by a third, and the numbers supported increased over 80%. The report also notes that a total of 564 individuals were supported by the perpetrator service, of which 460 were adults and 104 children. In October 2023, the newly commissioned New Era service commenced and continued to offer support to victims and perpetrators of domestic abuse. The Victim Service covers prevention, that's Tier 1, early intervention, Tier 2, targeted support, Tier 3, acute support, Tier 4, with an integrated support service, providing the essential bridge between the service and the behaviour change service. Support is provided for victims, for potential victims, for families, communities, businesses and stakeholders. Paragraph 18 of the report highlights that a total of 2,768 Staffordshire residents have been supported during the first 6 months of the service. 626 of these were existing service users, and a further 2,142 were supported from new referrals. Paragraphs 22 to 27 refer to the Behaviour Change Service and explain that following conversations about language and feedback from partners and service users, the Perpetrator Service has been renamed. The offer remains the same and spans prevention activity led by Victim Service Tier 1, Early Intervention Tier 2, targeted support Tier 3 and acute support Tier 4, with an integration support service providing the essential bridge between this service and the Victim Service. In the first 6 months of the contract, there have been 105 new referrals or inquiries for support into the Adult Behaviour Change Service for Staffordshire residents. I'd like to draw members' attention to the neutral front door support for children. That's a change from the previous Commission service because it's been recognised that not all children referred to in the Perpetrator Service required a perpetrator intervention, with many demonstrating learnt behaviours, sadly, from their household and actually required support as a low-level victim. All children referrals are made via the neutral front door and are risk assessed to determine support needs. A total of 600 children were supported in the Victim Service during this 6-month period. Details on outcomes of those completing the service are included as an appendix to the report. In addition, a total of 51 children were supported within the Behaviour Change Service. The report reflects that demands on the service have increased considerably and that the needs of those presenting are increasingly complex. This has resulted in waiting times in some aspects of the service, but following successful recruitment, I'm really pleased to be able to report that these are now reducing. The report highlights the mitigations in place to ensure waiting is kept to a minimum for those at higher risk. The report also provides an update for members on the Domestic Abuse Act duty and details the contracts put in place with refuge providers in Staffordshire to provide support for victims of domestic abuse in safe accommodation settings. The funding from DLUC has enabled contract terms to be commissioned for 2.5 years, with an option to extend for a further year, bringing sustainability and security to local service providers GLOW, Pathway and Staffordshire's Women's Aid. The 3 commissioned providers have 5 refuges, which can house 59 families and individuals at any one time, and an additional 11 dispersed units. In the first 6 months of their contracts, the 3 providers collectively supported a total of 347 victims and survivors within their safe accommodation settings, of which 143 were adults and 204 were children. The final paragraph advises that it's been possible for some of the funding from DLUC to be allocated to the New Era contract to enable support in safe accommodation settings beyond the refuge providers. At this stage, just before we go into questions, Chairman, if you don't mind, I'd like to hand over to Superintendent Furlong, who will provide some wider context regarding the police response to domestic abuse and how that links in with the commission service that we refer to and is outlined in this paper. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you then. Superintendent.
Okay. I have got just a little bit of context around domestic abuse in terms of Staffordshire Police, just to kind of set some scene, really. Domestic abuse is a strategic priority for Staffordshire Police. It's one of 3, so there's domestic abuse, children, and serious and organised crime. And with that comes significant scrutiny. Domestic abuse is scrutinised every day, so that goes right every morning from the operational front line and up through the daily meetings to the daily management meeting that is chaired by the ACC at 9 o'clock every day. And there we look at what our effective response looks like to domestic abuse and those incidents that are awaiting our response. Reported domestic abuse, including both crime and incidents, in the last 12 months is 26,465. And whilst that is a small reduction on the previous 12 months, that is a relatively stable number. The change is in the domestic abuse crime. So domestic abuse crime is down by 17% to 18,550 from 22,355. And that is primarily down to the crime recording, the change in crime recording. So principal crime recording, where we don't record every single crime that has occurred in one incident now, which was a move forward by the Home Office that is a move away from bureaucracy around having multiple records for officers to complete, and instead of actually concentrating on the actual investigation on behalf of the victim. All victims of domestic abuse crime are referred to the New Era service, and the victims of incidents, so where a crime has not occurred, those incidents, all domestic abuse incidents, are reviewed. They have a secondary review to make sure that the risk assessment is accurate and correct, and also to make sure that there is nothing that's been missed in the officer's first attendance, because as you can appreciate, sometimes they might be diverted to a different incident, and there may be some follow-up work that needs doing. That secondary review also includes a triage with the local authority with children's social care. That happens for both Stoke and Staffordshire, and that gives us an opportunity to view the incident from a child's perspective, not just through a police lens. It gives us that kind of view of how well known is this child to the local authority, and what is the appropriate support that we need to put in place. Domestic abuse accounts for around a quarter of the calls for service into Staffordshire Police, and with it being such a significant number, it's important that all of our staff recognise how important domestic abuse is and their role in doing that. We put together some bespoke training. We worked with Dr. Jane Monkton-Smith, who is a well-known professional within the domestic abuse field, and we've put together bespoke training for our officers that focuses on the 8 stages of homicide, and clearly being able to identify the risk, the high risk that may be present within domestic abuse incidents. And this then also assists in them, particularly for incidents where there's no crime originally identified, knowing whether or not they need to refer to New Era anyway. Because whilst the crime referrals go automatically over. All of the other domestic incidents don't automatically all go to New Era. So it's about looking at actually which ones do need to be referred in. 31% of domestic abuse crimes result in an arrest, and this has increased from 22% at the beginning of this year. And our false positive outcome rate for domestic abuse is currently at 11.2%. However, there are some areas in the county that are achieving just under 14%. So these would be South Staffordshire, Cannock and Tamworth, that are all in the kind of 13 point, but towards the 14%. Marek is well established in the force and across the partnership. This was a change when we had our inspection in 2021 around the child protection inspection and the improvement work that then followed, where it was recognised that actually the decision making happening in districts, in local policing areas where people, the people working there and the partners know these people, as opposed to it being a process that sits centrally and then it follows a process as opposed to really having the people at the heart of that. And what we've seen is that the Marek cases have gone up by 4.4%, but the repeat Marek cases have gone down by 20%. So that's a really good indication of the work that's ongoing is working, and it's also a good indication that we've come away from a process where we would say that hits Marek threshold, therefore we are going to reconvene a Marek meeting when there's already work ongoing in the partnership environment, and actually just creates more process that takes us away from doing the work with victims. From a perpetrator perspective and utilising the courses that are offered by New Era, where we do a conditional caution, we can only do that on standard risk cases. And with that comes the standard risk perpetrator programme that is offered by New Era. And often there is a conversation around, can we increase the numbers of perpetrators that go to that scheme? But because it's only standard risk, if you could do it for medium risk, there would likely be more, but that is not something that the Home Office has approved. There is an ongoing pilot at the moment. Staffordshire isn't part of that from a medium risk perspective, but there's an ongoing pilot around actually would it be appropriate for medium risk perpetrators to be able to access a perpetrator scheme via the conditional caution route. So I watch that closely around the outcome, because that may give us an opportunity even further with the service moving forwards. And on the subject of perpetrators, our domestic violence protection notices have increased by 101% in the last 12 months. So that's 275 being authorised in the last 12 months. And those that convert then into actual DVPOs, that's 229, and that's 86% increase on the previous year. So there's been a real drive around domestic violence protection notices, because they are an excellent tool to provide really quick safeguarding around victims. And it enables the police to take robust action across for offenders that breach that order. The change there is partly down to we didn't used to do domestic violence protection notices where there was bail conditions in place. So there's been a bit of a change in process and a change in culture that's been required around that, because it's absolutely essential that when a perpetrator leaves custody, if that file is not ready for a charge at that stage, if that perpetrator goes on to commit an offence very quickly after being released from custody, bail conditions can sometimes be a little bit of a toothless tiger in those early days, whereas the domestic violence protection notice offers that real quick time, robust safeguarding opportunity. So it's really great to see them in place. Just to talk through a couple of initiatives that we are hoping to kind of progress over the next 12 months. The first is known nationally as rapid video response, but in Staffordshire we are going to be calling it an enhanced video response. So what that's about is it's enabling victims to have alternative methods other than calling the police and waiting for a police officer to come out to them. So what that looks like is a specialist team of officers that will be able to converse with victims over video link. They will be able to do the risk assessments very early, and they will be able to take statements in that early stage, and then make sure that the risk assessment, the Operation Encompass referral that then comes from doing that risk assessment happens in a timely way. We understand the risk, and then we can then progress the investigation. I'm hopeful that this pilot, it's going to start in Stoke, and it will hopefully roll out before the end of the year. I'm engaged, we talked about this at the Domestic Abuse Commissioning Board, because I'm very keen, not only with New Era, but also with the other third sector domestic abuse support agencies in Staffordshire to work really closely on what that looks like in Stoke, so that when it rolls out into Staffordshire, we've had all the opportunity to shape that into the kind of offer that we would want that to look like. The last one, which is a gap for us at the moment, is around MATAC. So MATAC is the perpetrator-focused equivalent of MARAC. So MARAC is very victim-focused and has the victim at the heart of what it does, albeit it does do actions as well around perpetrators. MATAC is around looking at not necessarily the most high harm offenders, but it's looking at those persistent offenders that are repeat offenders. We piloted this in Newcastle last year around what that would look like for Staffordshire, because other forces have done it in different ways. And what we learned from that pilot was that actually it needs to be a force approach. So it needs to be looking at who are those most persistent offenders, rather than looking at it at a district level, where you may then be looking at lower level offenders in one area because you're looking at, say you pick 5 people that you're going to do this with. So I know that partners are really keen to look at this as what that's going to look like as a permanent kind of fixture in Staffordshire. The complexity around why that can't be rolled out quickly is because I really would like to get the partnership approach in place around how we manage victims. So when we start to do some really targeted work around offenders who don't actually want to work with us, how does that increase the risk to the victim? So until I'm satisfied that we've got a real good wraparound around the victim in that case, I wouldn't want to be just going off and doing a police-led intervention, if you like. So that's very much on the partnership radar and something that I know people are keen to push forward. And again, I'm hopeful that we will have something rolled out for that within the next 6 months would be where we would want to be going. And I think for the headlines, that was where I was going to finish, but happy to take any questions in relation to anything I spoke about.
No, thank you very much for that. I just would remind members that obviously we're talking about this report, which is the Council's response. I'm very grateful, though, to get that context of a policing response around it as well, because I think, as you just alluded to at the end there, it is very much a partnership approach around this and not just one agency. I wonder if I could just add a very simple question, and excuse me if it comes across a little blunt, but if we have all of this money and effort and new era and all of those fantastic things that we hear about, and also the police have a very sophisticated approach to dealing with offenders, why don't we see the numbers coming down? Would it be realistic to see them coming down? And of course, I think it is quite timely, isn't it, in as much as the National Police Chiefs Council only a couple of days ago published a report where it was talking about assaults on women. I know they're not all domestic assaults, but being at epidemic level and a national emergency, 1 in 12, 35% increase in 5 years. So it isn't a small thing that we're trying to deal with. But I'm just a little bit of a loss when we have all of this going on, but actually we don't see the figures coming down. I just love to get an understanding of why that is, and is it realistic to think that they might come down in the future?
Yes, I saw the same in the press around it being described as a crisis around the violence against women and girls strategy. I think that this, the answer to this question is always a challenging one because as we talk about it more and as we gain confidence, we would want to see things reported more. So often when you look at repeat calls coming in from a victim, it will be part of their safety plan around how they... Now, those victims may never wish to pursue a prosecution against the offender. And so that is part of the challenge around an increase in reporting isn't necessarily a bad thing. But what you would want to see is an increase in positive outcomes. So looking at the rapid video response, the enhanced video response, other forces that have used this have seen a real uptake in victims and their satisfaction of that service. And I think that one of the challenges for Staffordshire is keeping victims on board throughout the prosecution of offenders because of the backlog in the courts. It's taking time for things to get to court, and during that time we see victim attrition. So part of looking at the enhanced video response is how do we enhance that service to victims at the very front end? How do, when they call for service, how do we make sure that we're really timely in the support that we give them? And how do we make sure that we support them better through the court process? And I'm in conversations about, as we roll out the enhanced video response, actually is there more we can do from a victims and witnesses point of view in allocating somebody from our victims team to kind of hold the hand of the victim through, and what difference does that make? Because I think it gives us a real opportunity to see if we can measure, try some good ideas, and does that work for victims, and is that any better?
No, thank you for that. That's really encouraging. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you. Thank you for the report. I like it. And thank you for your contributions. The more one thinks about this, the more it's really a pretty complicated and difficult issue. I first want to focus on child and adolescent recidivism. Those 104 at the council level, and I'm sure there's many more with the police. It appears to be there appears to be more and more evidence that that those who practice such behaviour, particularly misogynist behaviour, go on to wider crime and sometimes terrorism. So the whole business of dealing with child and adolescent perpetrators, the threat is greater, but the opportunity is far greater as well. And I just want to know what the referral criteria is to support and deal with these usually men, young men, children, and what the recidivism rate is like amongst that particular age group, because we simply don't know what they'll go on to do. It could be very serious indeed. So the amplification of the threat and the opportunity is significantly higher, I would have thought, in that age group, given the wider risks to the community. The second thing is we don't know what we don't know, and this is what makes the numbers that the chair outlined and the superintendent's response. It begs a question. We simply don't know how much of this stuff is in the community. It could be getting more. It could be that women, particularly women, are more likely to respond. It's easier for them to do so with technology the way it is. But it does beg another question, which is something that is close to my heart, and that's the use of these. And this feeds back into the whole recidivism for youngsters again. We know that there's some terrible stuff on the internet, misogynist stuff. We know that incels, which for those who are not familiar with the term stands for involuntary celibates, men, write some pretty horrendous stuff. We know that a couple of years ago that they were responsible for about 50 killings in the United States alone. So I'm interested in the actual nature of the child and adolescent perpetrator service. I'm interested in whether that deals with these things. Because if it doesn't, the recidivism rate will persist. Of that, I'm clear. I just think that's a context, those youngsters, that I think is we need to plug into. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just to offer some assurance, because I sit on the Scrutiny and Assurance panel underneath the Children's Safeguarding Board in Staffordshire with Natasha Moody, and we absolutely recognise the importance of what, with children, particularly in the domestic abuse environment, the importance of identifying at the earliest opportunity when we can do something about this situation and put that early intervention and help in place. So just for reassurance around the broader, I suppose broader than, and I'll leave my colleague to talk about the specifics of the service and what that offers, but I think it's bigger than that in terms of we are doing a self-assessment currently around what the response looks like, with a particular emphasis around children to domestic abuse, knowing that you know, it's one of the three that is the biggest risk for children in their indicators kind of as they grow into adulthood. So we're really keen to make sure that, again, coming away from a centralised process, which is information sharing at Lindham House at the MASH, but actually what does the information sharing system look like across the whole piece? So when we're looking at family hubs, when family hubs come on board, how do we make sure that we work together as a partnership so that information is not just shared from one place to the other, but when we share it, what the reason we're doing it for and what we want to happen as a result of that, so we're more cognizant of impact and the difference that we're making. So it was just really to offer some assurance that it's well on our radar and an ongoing piece of work around what that looks like for the information sharing system and the opportunities that it presents to us.
If I can just add some further thoughts as well. So one of the things that was recognised in the previous contract that was changed as part of the new contract was around where children, and they're getting younger and younger in terms of presenting into the domestic abuse arena, that under the old arrangements, we may be treating them initially as a perpetrator. So we had two separate processes, and the model was kind of designed with the expectation that from the support from the perpetrator service for children would be within their own abusive relationships, and you know that age group support, the age group that we were supporting perpetrator services was at 12 plus. But the actual demographics showed that the majority of the referrals were from primary school children who had experienced domestic abuse in their family home, and were now replicating those behaviours towards siblings or parents. So while recognising that the abusive behaviours aren't appropriate and support should be given to, you know, sort of recognise, acknowledge and help do that behaviour change, labelling them at that stage as a perpetrator wasn't always the best solution. So what we've now got is something that we call the single front door, but it's a neutral front door. It's a single referral point, but it's established sitting within the victim service first and foremost. But each of those children that present in there are subject to an individual real risk assessment to understand absolutely what is the best support route for that individual, and sometimes that will remain in the victim service and sometimes it will go into the behaviour change service based on that. So we do try and make sure they're being triaged and directed to the most appropriate support for those individuals. I think one of the things I also wanted to add on the last point was around the contracted service, the provision service. Part of their remit is actually awareness raising, which has the effect, if it's successful, of making people feel it's easy. I've got a series of routes where I know I can actually go and get support. So just to echo my colleague's view that actually reporting numbers is not necessarily meaning an actual increase, just that people are more confident now in being able to put themselves forward.
Thank you for that.
And
Did you want to come back? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Chair,
Sorry,
just
my apologies, I thought you'd finished.
Yeah. So just to add, so New Era does have these dedicated programmes specifically for children to focus on that learnt behaviour and child-on-parent violence. So there's specific programme to try and address that as well, just to cover off some of the specific. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon, did you want to come back?
That's the wrong button. Yeah, thank you. I know very little about how the police works, but I'm just wondering, I mean, primary school children, if they're perpetrators, they're victims as well, aren't they? Clearly, which is what you've outlined. But if there's recidivism amongst that age group, is there a way of it being earmarked at a police level such that when they become adults, you don't lose that background? Because that, from what I'm led to believe, accentuates the threat of their behaviour in the future.
Yeah, if you could, please, Aisling.
I think we need to be really careful about recording children on police systems at that level. What I think is really important is the partnership approach to that. So that information must be available to the partnership, and I think that's the bit that we need to get better at, because we always talk about information sharing, don't we? Every serious case review we'll talk about better information sharing. If we would have known things before, all the jigsaw puzzle put together, and then so that information's really important. But I wouldn't want to get us into a situation where in policing terms we were almost creating a record for a child that was on police systems that, just in case for the future. It's one that I think, you know, from a criminal point of view, whilst I take the point, I think it's definitely better on partner systems, and then we need to be better at predicting where that future harm may go.
I fully understand that, but without that partnership, there's clearly a risk in the future, and it's really important that dynamic and that relationship remains strong in the future.
Just on that point, at Lindham House, if you've got concern about a child in a primary school environment that was displaying concerning behaviour that you're thinking is moving more into the tier 3 type of threshold, those kinds of referrals can come through into Lindham House, and there can be that information sharing, even if then there's no report to policing about that behaviour. So there's occasions when we will get together and have a conversation about some concerning behaviour, and that may stay single agency children's social care. But from a policing point of view, we've had an opportunity to have a conversation about that.
Can I just come back just once more, then I'll does it work the other way around? So do you ever ask the council, if you've got somebody who really is difficult, have they been seen as a child before in the council? Does the loop go the other way? Namely, so somebody in their mid-20s, were they seen as a 10-year-old because they were a perpetrator 15 years ago? Because that might influence how you the level of risk and how you would cope with it. So it's not just one-way traffic; it has to work both ways. Does that make sense?
So yeah, it does work the other way. So when we look at focusing on domestic abuse, when we look at information sharing, it doesn't, unless we were if there was no children involved, and say you've got two adults, say you've got two adults in their 20s involved in a domestic abuse incident, the time then when you would look to, and we call it third-party material, where you would go and look to what does social care hold, what do schools hold, what do health hold, that is when you are looking potentially to prosecute somebody. And you would look then to what sits in that background around what information is available. And you do that for victims, and you do that for perpetrators as well, around what the background looks like. We don't do it as a matter of course on all domestic abuse incidents to look at, well, why? That would be a really, on the numbers, it would be a really significant piece of work. So we are bespoke around where we do it and where we don't. But I totally take your point around understanding the background of behaviour.
I think there'd be all sorts of ECHR considerations around that. Some of these children would probably be under the age of criminal responsibility anyway. And I do think as a safeguard, schools are now well versed in safeguarding arrangements around this, the prevent agenda for, that, not that that is used all the time, but that process of recognising behaviour, recognising that there is some sort of challenging behaviour that then is, this notice, check and share goes through the safeguarding arrangements at the school without making judgments, and then on to some formal body that assesses it and makes sure that they're acting in the best interest. I think is a well-oiled machine in most schools now. So I do feel relatively comfortable that that's covered. I'd particularly welcome this business around the neutral front door. I think that is an important step forward. Councillor Snape, I think you indicated.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for an excellent report again. Prior to becoming County Council, I was part of a domestic violence team at Walsall County Council, was it Borough Council, before they basically went bust. My role was the team leader in the perpetrator programme. We had a 33-week perpetrator programme where the perpetrators had to pay £20 per session to come on it. They were referred from CAFCAS, various other organisations. I remember one guy going through it, did all 33 weeks. I marked him up as 88% chance he'd re-offend. Within 3 weeks, he'd raped his wife because she didn't want to have sex with him and assault his children. He got 12 years in prison for that. So it doesn't matter what people go through as a perpetrator program, they can still commit offence later. So that's just a start, really. I'm just going to go through things. Existing users, you use the term in the report. Does that mean repeat victims? When we go through Marek and we have, does every victim who goes through Marek have an IDVA, independent assessor, basically, advisor? Johnny has mentioned perpetrator and used the word perpetrator support. Define support, because to me, perpetrators, okay, not the children part, but the older ones, are criminals. That's why they're part of the programme. So are we supporting criminals, or are we treating them as treating them as victims? That's the word support. I mean, how do you put with a victim as opposed to a criminal? So really from that point of view. We say we've got 14, in the period, 14,807 adults, people who've used the service, but only 2,187 children. It seems a low number of children if there's children in relationships. Is it because victims perhaps are older, there's less children in the household, whatever it is? It just seems proportionally a very low number. Because if we've got domestic violence, really, every child in that house is a victim. It's learned behaviour. They're going to hear things. Even in bed, they're going to hear things. The fright of being in bed in the dark, hearing mum and dad arguing downstairs, whatever it's going to be. And on the perpetrators programme, and we say ours had to pay £20 a session, which then brought money back into the system. Do our victims, so our perpetrators, have to pay to go on those programmes, or is it funded by the county? A few questions, but I apologise, but I just think I'd like the answers. So thank you. Thanks, Trish.
If I can start by picking a few of those off, and apologies if I didn't quite catch them all, so please feel free to repeat them. So, yeah, just on the term existing users, that is just referring to users that were already with us when the contract changed. So they carry on, so they were with us, and then the new contract... Yeah, yeah. So the term in the report for both victims and perpetrators was around the fact that we didn't just stop treating with those people at the end of the 5-year contract. When the new contract came into being, they carried on. So we've used the term existing. So apologies for any confusion there. Yes, every MARAT victim does have an IDVA. In terms of the perpetrator when we talk about support. That is support very much focused at them changing their behaviour, as opposed to you know, what we're doing with the victim. It's very much about changing their behaviour. I think you asked about children. In the new Domestic Abuse Act, children are now victims in their own right. So we would but we, in terms of how we actually count them in the process. So that will start to impact on numbers, I would anticipate going forward, because that change is relatively recent. I don't know if Nikki wants to add anything to that.
I think that it's a challenge around when it changed, as you say, children living with domestic abuse, we've known that they've been victims in that environment forever. When it changed around the Domestic Abuse Act and made them victims, it didn't create any additional crimes, so they are still only a victim of crime if an offence is committed against them. And when that change happened, there was no further funding that came down to accompany that change. So this is part of the conversation that I was talking about with Scrutiny Assurance around actually, are we assured that in Staffordshire, all children living in a household of domestic abuse receive the correct response, the correct service and help that they need at that time? I can't sit here and say that I am assured that all children get that response. We do have Operation Encompass, so every time a risk assessment is completed and there are children linked to that domestic abuse incident, whether they were there at the time it happened or not, and they are school age, a notification goes to the school so that they know. They don't get a lot of information, but they know there's been a domestic abuse incident, which gives them an opportunity, if that is the one piece of the jigsaw that then assists them with either the way the child's presenting at school that day or any other concerns that they've got. So we do have that around children that are in a household with domestic abuse. I share your concerns around the low number of children with the New Era service, but I suppose the question there, that's why we're doing the self-assessment. And we're doing it across Staffordshire and Stoke-on-Trent. It was the Scrutiny Assurance Group in Staffordshire board that have pulled together the template, and it was presented at the Domestic Abuse Commissioning Board and got consensus there that it's absolutely a good piece of work to do to really understand the picture. So that's ongoing. So it's just to offer some assurance that we recognise the gap, and we are looking at how we're gonna address that gap. Because just to finish, some of those children will have social workers, family support workers, and actually therefore that gives us an opportunity for them to provide an intervention around whatever the circumstances are that child's living in. That doesn't mean it all has to funnel into one domestic abuse service, but we need assurance that that is in place across the system.
Please,
Do we do victims prosecution? So if a victim doesn't want to give evidence and say officer picked evidence up on video, whatever it's going to be, do we then do prosecutions? In extreme case, I'll put it, because I mean, we're not always going to do, but do we do that?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. I haven't got the data in front of me today about that, but we absolutely encourage that it should be an offender-centric investigation with the victim at the heart of what we do. So we should be concentrating on the perpetrator's behaviour and what we can do about that. So we absolutely do look for opportunities to do victimless prosecutions, and certainly when I get a call around domestic violence protection notices, even if in the middle of the night around doing them, I will always want to know, what have we done before we decide to take no further action? What have we done around progressing that investigation, regardless as to whether the victim's on board or not? There are some cases where I think that if a victim really doesn't want to pursue an investigation and they've got good reason for why they don't want to do that, I would not want us to sometimes take it out of their hands if that's going to drive their reporting underground and they wouldn't call us again because we've done that. So I think it's not a case of we do it every single time, but absolutely it's something that we're really looking for opportunities to drive forward.
thank you for that. I think, Catherine, you wanted to just make a point.
Just to provide further reassurance, really, we're working really closely at the moment with our children and families colleagues, because we are also aware that the numbers that are going into the New Era service do seem low. So we just want to understand why that is and just double check that there's not children that were missing, and that also that all of our social workers are aware of the service that New Era offer, so that they're being signposted through to that service if appropriate. So it's an ongoing piece of work, but working really closely with Natasha and Nisha to follow that through.
Thank you. Reverend Metcalfe.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. I have some indirect knowledge and contact with the Staffordshire Women's Aid. And I'm just asking the practical question, really. Do you have confidence that that organisation and the other two organisations will have the capacity and the resources to meet all envisaged need in the future? I ask this because it seems to me that the Staffordshire Women's Aid depends still to a considerable extent on voluntary support and voluntary contributions. Only just recently, anticipating an increase in demand during the school holidays, they've appealed for donations of dry foods and tin foods and so on. So can we be confident that the resources are available to meet all the needs of children who are vulnerable at this time in Staffordshire?
So the safe accommodation funding that the County Council get as part of the legislation has enabled that funding that we've received from DLUC to provide contracts for Staffordshire Women's Aid, GLOW and Pathway, the other two refuge providers in the county. The level of funding from DLUC has meant that we have been able to put in place contracts to provide that support within the provision, within the refuge for more than a year. So in terms of the way in which they're now funded, it has given a bit more security and a bit more sustainability to those organisations. So I do know that was very gratefully received in terms of how we're able to do that. So the DLUC funding, we hope will continue at the level it continues, and we hope that it will come in more than single year increments so that we can continue with that sustainability. I don't think the thing that the area that we can't really give assurance on from that support fund is around that wider picture in terms of the physical bricks and mortar, because the funding that we have isn't able to go into, for example, building more refuge space. But what we can do is support what's needed for those refuge spaces that there are in Staffordshire. The fund is allowing us to do that and do it on more than just a single year basis.
Reverend, did you want to come back?
There is still quite a dependence on voluntary support in addition to the funding, which I'm sure, I agree with you, is very welcome, and we recognise and appreciate that. Is the voluntary support needed less than it used to be, or are you still depending on a level of voluntary support for these refugees?
We've been able to fund Staffordshire Women's Aid and the other two refuges higher than they were funded previously since we've had this fund. So what that has meant for the refugees, they have been able to employ specialist support staff, which when you're only on a very short contract is actually quite difficult, because you're into the realms of very short contracts where they've actually been able to secure more paid specialist resource. Clearly they will still use volunteers as well to actually provide the best support, that the most support they can. But yes, the funding has enabled more paid posts into those refuges.
Thank you for that. Just forgive my scepticism when I read the report. I always get a little concerned when I see suggestions that the way that we measure things is 99 or 100% successful, particularly given the complicated nature of domestic violence. When I looked at how we measure these initiatives, It's measured in a questionnaire. I think it's about people's outcomes to 9 particular areas. And it's about whether people see an improvement in any of those. And it's I've been very subjective here, but it talks about whether you think twice or count to 10 or whatever it is before you decide to act. There's quite a lot of peer-reviewed studies, as you'd expect, around domestic violence. And one of the things that comes out in all of those studies is the focus on repeat offenders. That Pareto type analysis that says 80% of the threatened risk is within 20% of the offending population. I don't see any reference in here to dealing with those both repeat offenders and repeat victims. And that is very often seen as a measure of success of domestic violence initiatives. The question is, are we happy with the measurement? Are we happy that people who go through these schemes simply have to indicate an improvement, not that they agree with the 9 outcomes, but an improvement in their thought processes or the way they behave or act, particularly when, like it suggests in here, that success rates are 99 to 100%. That doesn't sound right to me.
So if I may respond first and then hand to my police colleague. What we've put in the report is simply what we see outcomes from the victim perspective. So that isn't the be-all and end-all measure that we have, but actually how the victim is feeling after being through that support was something that we wanted to share. In terms of other reporting from the provisioned service and understanding how that provision service is performing, there's a comprehensive performance framework, quarterly performance meetings with that provider that goes into a lot of detail. I think on your point about reoffending and reoffending rates, New Era and the police, there's some arrangements just being finalised so that when that perpetrator course is completed, then those people that have been through that, those perpetrators, they're looking at the police records. It's due to start later this year, but looking at those on a 6-month and a 12-monthly basis to actually understand from the perpetrator's perspective if there is any continued offending. But I'd like to give some assurance that the provisioned service, which this paper focuses on, there is a very comprehensive performance framework that's considered by ourselves, by the County Council, by Stoke City Council and by the lead commissioner in the Commissioner's office as well. And that's sort of there as a formal arrangement every quarter. But would you like to say anything from a police perspective on repeat?
From the service that's provided by New Era, and indeed the service before, for the conditional cautions, it's always been the case that there is a low level of reoffending for the standard risk perpetrator programme. I suppose my question there, being cynical myself, would be, because it's only standard risk, lower level, would they have gone on to offend anyway? Or actually, would these have been cases where they wouldn't have? And I don't know the answer to that, but that's one I've challenged myself with before. Around what's just been updated there, around what does the longer term look like? So with all these people who've been through a perpetrator programme, have they gone on to reoffend within 12 months, 2 years? I haven't done that work around understanding exactly the detail that sits at the other side of there, but it's certainly a good action to take away and have a look at.
I just wondered whether it would be possible to have that level of data the next time that this report comes. I think that would be particularly useful. I still find it quite shocking that it's still only a standard risk. I think I share your concern about the way that is viewed, given the current nature of it. The last question then to Councillor Snape.
Well, it's two short questions. It's a follow-on for Trish's last answer, really. Many years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, a new act came in where many perpetrators will go from, once they report, they'll go from one victim to another victim. We, as police force, you can let victims know the background of a perpetrator. Are we doing that in Staffordshire? And the second one really is, when England are playing in international competitions, domestic violence always goes up. Have we got any figures yet? I don't need the figures, just has it gone up, or is it too early to get those figures? Really? Because it always seems to go up, doesn't it?
So I'll take the football question first. So the national reporting in relation to domestic abuse around the football is, it doesn't, we talk about it like that is the case, but actually I've not seen any data that actually says when England play, we get more domestic abuse that happens. It's more of a narrative that follows the football, that it must. So this year, there has been a national feedback on data. So every time there was a match, we fed back in from a Staffordshire point of view around the number of domestic abuse incidents that have come in around the time of the match. So that data has been collected nationally. I haven't had it back yet, so I don't know what the outcome of it's been and around that picture. But for sure, we can feed that back in when we do find out. And then what was your first question again? Sorry. Yes, Clare's Law. Yes, Clare's Law. So, Clare's Law, it has gone up in terms of the right to ask. We always see, when we do domestic abuse campaigns, we will always see an increase of right to ask. So there's been a drive on that, and we have seen an increase in it. Right to know, there has been an increase, but there's for sure more work to do there. So I talked about the harm reduction hubs that we have in each of our districts in the local policing teams, and the right to know is part of the work that we are encouraging them to do. So when they do their secondary risk assessments, whenever they come across an opportunity as that, and I have seen some, from dip sampling, some really good examples of where they've gone on to cases that they're not even doing a secondary risk assessment on, but they've reviewed an incident and said there could be an opportunity here for a right to know. So it's absolutely in their minds, but it's something from a performance point of view we want to monitor across the districts so that we understand exactly which places are doing it and exactly which places maybe there's some room for improvement there.
Thank you for that. Councillor Wilson, did you want to close, or are you happy?
I was going to read the recommendations, but I'll leave that with yourself.
I reserve the right to hang on to the recommendation. Huge thank you for the report. I thought it was excellent. It's a difficult area for all of the partners, isn't it? I do find it hugely encouraging, though, to hear the load of work and the sophistication of some of that work, particularly around young people. Again, as I said before, I very much welcome this neutral front door that looks at young people, not necessarily through the lens of them being offenders. It was incredibly interesting to get the police perspective as well, so thank you, Superintendent Furlong, for coming along and doing that for us, because I do think it's an important part that without it, it's just missing. We just see what we're doing. I think there are still some concerns about value for money, what that looks like moving forward. Do we have the data? But I was encouraged to hear that maybe we can have that at a future meeting. So, as per the recommendations, it is to review and comment upon the comment on the content, which I think we've done, and note the progress to date. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming along, and thank you for taking the questions. Thank you. Can I just say, for the members of the committee, I know it's 5 to 12, but the only thing we've got left is just to look at the work programme. Item 6. So if I could ask Deborah just to run us through what we have agreed, and then we'll finish. Yeah, carry on.
Thank you, Chairman. So the report was included in your pack. It clearly states at section 6 that we had a work programme informal meeting on the 8th of July. and the subsequent proposed changes will be incorporated into the work programme. These include briefing on the Family Help Project, the Academies system, including the role of the Regional Schools Commissioner, and work to improve attainment, schools absenteeism and allocation of SEND school places. I have got some additional information on this which I'll circulate following the meeting, Chair. We've also got in our work programme a proposed report on school social exclusion, a possible joint working group with Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the new care management system. We had an informal meeting and briefing session on that, which was well received by the Cabinet members and chairs and vice chairs of both committees. It's also likely there'll be a joint report later on that in the year on the new care management system. And also within your work programme will be progress with the ILACS improvement plan. If there's any further questions on that, Chair, I will circulate the paper and come back to us. At the next meeting, on the 12th of September, you have 4 items: managing self-neglect, adult safeguarding, backlog reduction, recommissioning of children's community support framework, including domiciliary care, and the family support recommissioning.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Unless there are any questions, I'm going to bring it to a halt. There's nothing else, is there? No. Thank you again. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your inputs.
Circulated.
Oh, there you go. Do you want